Welcome, everyone. Welcome to day 39 of the 75 Days of Partition Live podcast series that the 1947 Partition Archive has been doing to commemorate this landmark year. I'm Sonam Kalra. I'm a musician with my own body of work in music, delving into the partition using poetry and writings of that time, coupled with oral histories. And I'm here on behalf of the 1947 Partition Archive to welcome our very, very special guest today, Professor Sanjeev Jain. I'm co-hosting with Gunita and Noor Anand Chawla and Aprajita. Dr. Sanjeev Jain is a clinician with research interests in the genetic basis of psychiatric and neurological diseases. He heads the Molecular Genetics Laboratory at the NIMHANS, which collaborates in several population and cohort studies and provides genetic testing for some neurodegenerative disorders. Dr. Jain has been involved with volunteer work with both governmental organizations and NGOs, and he was a member of the committee for drafting the mental health policy document for India. He has been researching the history of mental health services in India from the colonial to the very contemporary period, including very, very importantly, the effects of partition and developments post-independence. His work has helped him to understand the interface between science and medicine and social responses to mental illness in India. In today's conversation, he will shed light on the mental and psychological effects of the partition. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Jain. It's truly such an honor to have you, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation and from all that we're going to learn from your findings. I'm going to jump straight into this because these are short bursts of conversation. I was talking to you just 5 minutes ago about the book that you wrote and co-edited called The Psychological Impact of the Partition of India. We all know that the partition of India, much as history books describe it to be just a line, the Radcliffe Line, and it's taught to us like that, right? There's no talk of any of the emotion. But we know that the partition of India was a partitioning of minds as much as it was a geographical division. And there's been very little discussion about it. We tend to sweep it under the carpet, as we do often as Indians. There's been very little discussion in mental health discourse on the scars, the psychological scars that it caused. And I would be so interested, we know that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was studied on a larger basis in the soldiers affected by World War II. Why hasn't it been studied in partition, and how do you think in your studies have you found it to impact people post-partition?
Right. So that's two different streams of queries. Right.
Yes, please answer them at your own way.
Yeah. So coming to the first one, see, we've been working on the history of hospitals and specifically mental hospitals during this period. And during our work, we found a peculiar letter noting by Mountbatten. After some popular unrest, he makes a specific comment that the asylum of Lahore will not be partitioned. Specifically, he puts that in his daily diary that contrary to popular belief, the hospital will not be partitioned. And that gets covered in the Statesman, and there is a Mountbatten response to it. So the idea, this was around the time of Toba Tek Singh's 100 years or something, of Mantos. And the idea that Toba Tek Singh could actually be a real event and not merely a farce became very apparent. So then we went back to the records, and then we found that the hospital was actually partitioned very specifically over time. Yeah. And not only that, the partitioning went on and on and on. The hospitals in Ranchi were partitioned, in Nagpur, in Tezpur. So Hindu and Muslim patients were divided up all over India and sent off to the other country. Now, that really creates a problem. But if a country can't assure that the marginalized will be looked after decently and honestly, irrespective of caste, color, creed, what kind of countries were we creating?
Right.
So that is what the initial impetus was. And then we started looking at how this whole dividing of minds, as you correctly put it, was created. Now, one must remember this was the time of the European divisions, of fascism and all those things. And many of those ideas were transformed or transported into India. And you see this in the 30s, there is still an assumption that somehow we'll all muddle together
Mm-hmm.
and somehow things will not be so bad. But in the 1940s, the lines become sharper and sharper. There's a book by Chimanlal Setan by I forget the author, called The Political Insanity of India, which says that this kind of drawing lines across people's lives, cultures, is absolutely wrong. Beni Prasad Agarwal, who is a professor of psychology at Allahabad University, says that this is completely absurd. You're trying to split apart a culture which is a modern culture in the making. It's a modern
Yeah.
multicultural ethos which is in the making, and you're trying to revert the whole subcontinent into these kinds of binaries, and this is completely wrong. The British themselves recognize the hysteria of the population and how they can be, you know, manipulated by hysterical outpourings. So it's a very calculated move to create these divisions, which ends up gradually justifying the partition. So, right in the beginning, in 1939-40, there is a post-mortem analysis of the violence in Calcutta. And the post-mortem report says most of the wounds were in the back, saying that the people who did this were at least afraid to look at people in the eye when they were
Gosh.
doing these things. By 1947, the post-mortem reports are exactly the opposite. They say the one who wielded, I can heal the stab wound in the chest of the person, but the damage to the soul of the person who has knifed another
Right.
person, that will take longer to heal. So,
Gosh.
and these are all medical records. These are all medical doctors writing about their experience. So this kind of a first-person account of how doctors and how the health profession viewed this whole process was something that we try to understand. Because after all, you know, in any emerging bourgeois society, the doctor, the lawyer, the soldier are the so-called pillars of society. And
Right.
hospitals, schools, courts are supposed to be impartial and available to everyone. What did you find? A bomb is set up in Gangaram Hospital in
Oh
Lahore.
God.
A person is killed in the lawns of the Amritsar General Hospital because of religion. A doctor is killed in Paharganj. A doctor is killed on the Lahore railway station. People who killed the doctor here are awarded with awards there. People who killed the doctors in the other side are given awards here. So there's a systematic destruction of the notion that universal healthcare can be a possibility. The
Or
doctors
sanit.
can work, yeah, the doctors can
San-
work without paying attention to religion and caste and creed. So that whole idea gets destroyed.
Yeah.
So, and that is a very deliberate kind of destruction at the root of a modern society. So you get schools getting partitioned, you get hospitals getting partitioned, and that is really ensuring that the scars of the partition will be very, very,
Long.
very long. Because none of these things of modernity, of modern humanist
Of
ethos,
humanity. Right.
humanity will not occur. So that
Prevail. Yeah.
sets you forward. Now coming to the PTSD part. Now PTSD technically was recognized as a shell shock or things like that in the First World War. And the British set up entire hospitals in London and all over England to handle the shell shock of the returning soldiers. Even at that time, they noticed that the Indian soldiers just became Langla Lula. They actually use the word Langla Lula as a British parlance for you know having exaggerated physical deficits. But they assume that this is actually a injury to the spine or the muscle and not a psychological trauma. Although they note that the terror of being buried inside a trench in France when you come from the fields of Punjab or Tamil Nadu can be quite traumatic. So, but they recognize that it is a traumatic event, but they don't really see it as a psychological issue. They see it more as a physical issue. Even in the Second World War, the majority of the PTSD kind of picture is mainly to do with the white soldiers of the American and the British Army. For example, you don't hear of PTSD of the German soldier ever, or of the Japanese soldier. So it's mainly it's to do with that. Of course, the PTSD of the Holocaust has been dissected forever and forever in
Yeah.
intricate
Ad
and elaborate
infinitum. Yeah,
detail,
yeah, yeah.
ad infinitum.
Yeah.
So the so why the silence? Why there was silence around the partition? Therefore, becomes even more mysterious. A simple thing can be that there were just about less than 50 psychiatrists in the whole of India. There were just about 4 departments of psychology in the whole of
But
India.
But it is very
So
mystifying, as you said. It was the
it is
largest mass
mystifying.
displacement in the history of
Absolutely.
humanity.
Yes.
I think, as you just said, and I'll come back to, I know I merged the two questions, but I felt they were connected because, just the fact that you said seemingly sane people were driven to do what they
Yeah.
did. What
Yep.
made them come there? What did they deal with when post doing it? I know that previously, when there was another series that Partition Archive had done, we had spoken with author and writer, Pakistani author and travel writer Salman Rushdie and Salman Rashid, and he had said not only did he go back to the family home to find out why someone in his family had been killed, but the son of the man who had killed the family carried the guilt of his father. His father never forgave himself for what he did, and I mean, just the thought of the burden that they carry.
Yeah.
And the fact that, as you said, it's mystifying that we don't talk about it
Yeah.
enough. But even thinking, what do you think? I mean, when we have not delved enough into what caused this mass hysteria that you just spoke of, what caused people who lived together for centuries to suddenly turn on one another.
Well, I'm not a historian, so I wouldn't be able. I think my efforts in that would be very amateurish. But to me, it seemed more like one could facetiously call it divide and rule in perpetuity. So that uh, for example, during the Second World War or before so-called undivided India, the population of undivided India was larger than that of China. We had a larger industrial base. We had more colleges. We had a more educated middle class. We had almost 40 mental hospitals, which I think is the only gesture of civilization in modern society. China had none. So, and so the whole, but we had the Quit India movement,
Right.
and we were seen as having stabbed the allies in the back, and this was just payback time. Cut you down to size as we leave. So I think
Yeah.
it was just geopolitical, play acting, and they didn't really concern. I mean, they had been making the Sykes-Picot line to divide the Middle East. They made the Durand line to divide Afghanistan. They made the Radcliffe line. They made the line on the east, the China line. These are all metaphorical lines that were drawn into the
Yeah.
land, and they did it in
Yeah.
Africa forever, and creating more bloodshed. So, but like Beni Prasad Agarwal pointed out, that Indian society was a society in transition, moving towards something better, higher, and things like that. And this kind of discourse, this kind of process, really put the whole society back
Yeah.
a very, very large way.
Absolutely. I mean, also just the trauma that not only those people who lived through partition suffered, but the subsequent generations. In the study
Absolutely.
that you may have done, what was the findings that you found, or that other doctors and psychiatrists have found that
So,
perhaps?
so this was an earlier paper that we'd written. So we picked up accounts of the partition, first-person accounts, partly from Urvashi Butalia's book, a few from the
Right.
1947 archive, and a few from the accounts of the victims of the massacres in Kigali, because that was also ethnic. Uh, in Africa, and obviously we anonymized them and we sent them around to a number of psychiatrists and psychologists in the country, saying, if a person came to you with this kind of problem, what would you do? And almost all of them recognized post traumatic stress disorder. All of them. All of them recommended there should be therapy. All of them felt that there could be some role of drugs for a short while. But the fact that PTSD was identified by the overwhelming number showed that the capacity to recognize PTSD in the first person accounts of the survivors of the partition was quite obvious. Now, like I said, at that time there were only 40 or 50 psychiatrists in the whole of India. Most of them were officers in the army, and there was hardly any civilian psychiatrists. So there was little attention paid to the needs of the civilians in that sense. There was there wasn't enough discussion about the psychological space of all of us. All of us were merely natives. We were viewed mainly as representatives of the martial Punjabi, the martial Kurg, the peace loving Bengali, the wily, whatever. So we were seen as archetypes of tribes and ethnicities rather than individual persons in their own right,
Right. Right.
unlike the European consciousness, which was always oriented towards the individual. So all the trauma was meant to be community trauma. It was assumed that the communities would look after themselves. So you set up refugee camps, and you segregated the Punjabi refugee colonies from the Bengali refugee colonies, from Mirpuri refugee colonies, and somehow they would get along and rebuild their lives. What happened to the individual was not a preoccupation of our fledgling nations. We were so caught up in this communitarian identities that we had no time for individuals. And psychiatry is about individuals. So we missed this whole building up awareness of what it costs in individual lives would have educated us not to talk about sectarianism forever and forever,
Yeah.
because we didn't address the individual problems of the big partition. We live with 100 partitions now.
Right, absolutely.
Because,
And I think we live with the silence. I mean, the
yeah,
fact that people keep silent is part of that PTSD because they are unable
is,
to talk about it. I
yes,
do a
absolutely.
performance on partition, Professor Jain, and when I finish the performance, you cannot imagine the number of people who come to me with tears in
Right,
their eyes because they have, for that moment, they're able to get that momentary
right.
release, but still they don't talk about it. And we don't talk about it as a community, even though we've said that it was the community's responsibility. We don't talk about it as not only as
Yeah.
individuals, but as a community enough. But also, we don't talk about enough, and there have been books on them and poetry by Manto, I mean,
Yeah,
prose by
yeah,
Manto,
yeah.
and some poem about the impact on women. Because
Hmm.
women were really commodities at this time. I mean, they were
Hmm.
property, they were commodity. Whether it was, I've heard stories from my great grandmother, my grandmother, who told me that her great grandmother's village, the women to save their honor were jumping into wells. We've all heard these
Hmm.
stories,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then the wells were filling up so much that they no longer could kill themselves to save themselves, in the irony of it all, right? But women who were taken across to the other side, when they come back, their husbands take them back, but they are unable to look at them as women or as wives anymore. They're treated differently. What has there been any study done on the
No,
on the PTSD on
no,
women specifically and
no,
the subsequent
no,
generations?
no, not really. See, we are handicapped by the very real fact that no medical records are available for the period.
Right.
None.
Yeah.
Zero. We have records till 1948, when the hospitals in Delhi are still documenting how many fractures, how many stab wounds, how many things are being seen on a daily basis. Okay, so there's actually a record, a table which is produced by the government every day. But
Right.
by early 48, it disappears. By the time the big refugee influx happens, and after that, there are simply no medical records. We know for a fact that a hospital was set up
Mm-hmm.
in Delhi or in parts of North India to perform abortions or to make sure that pregnancies, if the woman who was being repatriated was found to be pregnant,
Gosh.
then the child had to be born in a hospital and taken away, or had to be aborted. So, so India actually extended this whole abortion business uh, quasi legally in the 50s. And hospitals were set up to do this, which was technically completely illegal at that point of time. So, so nobody ever kept a record of who were these women who were being subjected to abortion without their consent, just because they
And
had been
leaving their
impregnant
children
and
behind. Yeah.
leaving their children or
Gosh.
sending them away. We have no paper records. All we know that this whole debate between Miruzullah Sarabhai on one hand and the TIS and the other people, then you know snowballed into a big debate on women's issues, and by the end of the 50s, the whole thing was stopped. This
Right.
repatriation of women was stopped, I think, around 56 or 57. But we can't find any actual documentation of this.
But also, I think that people, as we come back to the fact that no one wanted to talk about it, I don't suppose the
Yeah,
women
yeah,
wanted to talk. They lived with that very PTSD
yeah,
quietly
yeah,
because it was
yeah,
considered
yeah.
taboo to discuss these things.
Yes,
But,
yes.
this you feel, and I mean, I will talk from a personal point of view. I never heard stories of any sadness from my grandmother, perhaps because they wanted to protect subsequent generations. I only heard of this wonderful time that she had in Rawalpindi, and yet when I crossed the border with no baggage whatsoever, there was a generational sadness. I actually, I'm not a doctor, and I mean, unlike you, but I felt it in my DNA. I felt the sadness when I crossed the border by foot. And I've often wondered how that gets carried across generations. This scarring, this pain. I mean, how does that happen? And what are your findings on this?
So, in a sense, many of us, for example, my grandparents also moved from Lahore. And so for some medical conference, I've been there twice. So but I live and work in Bangalore. And you can see the difference in the sense of rootedness now to, let's say, the village or their town or their culture people have here, because
Yeah.
there has not been a partition. I mean, even if there has been, it's been trivial, drawing lines
Yeah.
between Bangalore and Tamil Nadu.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's never been accompanied by any actual, you know, movement of
Violence.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but but to have a population which has been marooned in that sense, there is uh, one of the first books that came out of this whole effort of the partition was the very first inquiry that the UNESCO did. It was called In the Minds of Men, which was a official UNESCO inquiry exactly about the question you asked. Why did people behave so badly in a civilized country like India? So they commissioned an American psychologist to do this study, and he looked at various factors, and then he noticed that that somehow the cultural and the emotional lives had been driven apart by a series of you know sloganeering or rhetoric over the last 10 or 20 years. And this social distancing had really damaged society. And, and he had very interesting observations. He said, but in villages where children of both communities played together, or in towns where they played together, there was the least amount of violence. And
Oh,
just
interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
just places where there was more person to person contact, it was different. Now,
Yeah.
one can't explain the viciousness of the violence that we all know occurred,
Right.
but there is also some truth in the whole idea that much of this was not as spontaneous as it's made out to be. It was not all just junoon and pagalpan or frenzy, as Mahatma Gandhi and the others kept calling it, a moment of madness. He actually called it a return
Right.
to
He does.
sanity. Yeah,
Yeah.
he kept referring to it as a temporary insanity. That the people who planned it were actually kind of the returning soldiers of the Second World War, who had military skills to plan and execute ambushes and use firepower with accuracy. So, well, I don't think those things will ever be answered in our lifetimes. After all, Mountbatten's papers have been put into perpetual cold storage for another 40 years. So, not in my.
The
So,
truth that they never want to uncover, I
yeah,
suppose,
yeah,
in
yeah.
some ways.
So I don't think we'll ever know, and we have not kept the records. But So it's a difficult thing to really, you know, uh, penetrate right through. But the trauma issues really, get compounded. Many years ago, I read a paper in one of the psychiatry journals where they were trying to understand the consequence of the Holocaust by having group therapy sessions with the children of the Holocaust victims, with the children of the guards of the concentration camps.
Okay.
Okay, to
Wow.
see how that would work out. Okay, because ultimately you have to move on.
Right.
You
You
have to
have to learn.
recognize, you have to learn. You can't just sweep it under the carpet and say it was madness and it'll never happen again. Because it will happen
No,
again if you
it
don't
will.
learn your lessons.
Yeah, because the wound is not healed and you
The wound is
cannot
not,
then keep.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but when you said the word maroon, that struck a chord with me, and it's something I think about really often is how the impact, and it's so pertinent to the refugee crisis as well, the impact of not belonging
Yep.
overnight. What is
Yep.
that? You belong to a certain community, you belong to a certain people, everything you know to be your world, whether they are your friends, your home, your land.
Yeah.
Overnight, you're like, get up, leave. Those very people turn against you. Having lived through the 1984 riots myself, you felt it
Yeah.
briefly.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
this, what kind of long-term impacts would this have had on people as well? Becoming a refugee, and that word is
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
treated
Yeah.
with such disdain,
Yes,
right?
yes, 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 yes. Even in the 40s, there were editorials in many newspapers in Bombay and Delhi that the refugees were vitiating their city, that they were disrupting their civilized way of life, and all these uh, uncouth Punjabis and Sindhis were disturbing the civilized mores of old Delhi, and
Right,
but this rootedness is a very important concept because ultimately a lot of psychological well-being relies on that
right,
rootedness.
right, right,
A chronic anomie is not good for one's mental health. You need to feel rooted. You need to have a sense of continuity, which is
right.
not just your own personal history, but also you know, ancestral, or you know, like the one of the British uh, professors used to quote that you can't be a good doctor unless you understand 2,000 years of human history,
Right.
because
Yeah.
because it's a shared experience of the whole of humanity that you're
Right.
talking about.
Right.
And to
Right.
suddenly realize that you are separate for no decision of your own from the
Right.
history of where you were, that
Right.
place history is foreign, not just the current existence, but its entire history is now going to be a foreign history. Now that
Yeah.
is really unsettling.
But I
And
think
one of the
that's
reasons,
exact. Sorry, please go ahead.
yeah,
No, no. One
no,
of the
so that,
reasons.
and one of the reasons why many refugees just don't stop running. You find them that of the migrant populations of India, the Sindhis and the Punjabis are by far the largest all over the world. Because once you
Right.
realize you can be moved for no reason at all, you might as well keep moving.
Gosh. Yeah.
And that is
Yeah.
literally, if you look at it, that is exactly how it has happened.
And yet, when they'll meet each other, whether, I mean, no matter what, I mean, when you meet through the eyes of humanity, you meet an Indian meets
Right.
a Pakistani, that whether it's a child meeting another child in a
Yeah.
university, they will gravitate towards each other
Yeah, 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 yeah.
without thought, right? It is so
Yeah, absolutely.
genetically deep rooted in them to gravitate to this place of
Yeah,
comfort, to home, as you said,
yeah, yeah.
that it's
'Cause
quite incredible. Um,
the
I mean, what
past is
is
the home to all of us. A common past is our common home.
yeah,
That's a fact. I mean, you can't deny that fact.
yeah,
So
but what do you think? I mean, this trauma of partition. What is the way forward in dealing with this PTSD? I mean, what would you
I,
personally?
I think there has to be a much more honest and serious debate about what happened, in the sense that the German philosopher Hannah Arendt, who wrote all those, and uh, who wrote about the problems of totalitarian kind of existence. Uh, she was a student of Heidegger, and Heidegger had become completely Nazified. And she really could not understand how the high priest of philosophy could offer a philosophical justification for Hitler. And over the next 10 or 20 years after the Second World War, she very systematically repudiated all the foundational basis on which Nazism was created.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of deep-rooted analysis as to why did we allow, or why do we continue to allow, in a sense, narrow identities to be the focus of our social and political life. Why is it that we continue to repudiate any sense of universal humanity, or universal humanism, or society freed of these kinds of dimensions of religion, caste? Why is it that South Asian society is stuck in the past? Unless we address that issue in every aspect of our life, from popular culture to philosophy to medical care, it won't work. Now,
Yeah.
if people feel, for example, there was a riot some years ago in Aligarh or something, and patients were killed in their hospital beds based on their religion. That was a rumor
Yeah.
that the doctors had not looked after the non-whatever
Oh God.
patients. And this is an exact replica of what happened in Tilak Nagar in Delhi in 1947,
7. Yeah.
in which the patients of a particular community were earmarked and killed inside the hospital. So from 47 till the 21st century, we do the same
It's the
things.
same thing.
Now that is
Because the
astonishingly
narrative,
horrid.
yes, because the narrative isn't changing, and as you said, if we're not having a healthy debate about it, then we're not
Yes,
moving forward and we're not learning. But thank you
yes.
so much for having this conversation and this debate with us, Professor Jain. Honestly, I feel like we could continue for a really long time, but these are the short bursts. But I
Yeah,
am
yeah.
going to bother you for sure, and pick your brain. It's been absolutely incredible, and the work you're doing on understanding, I think that the PTSD, understanding the long term psychological scars of partition, is hopefully going to benefit many people. So, thank you
We
so
hope
much for
so.
this. And your
I,
findings will benefit many of us who
I,
read them.
all we can hope is it never happens again.
We can hope and pray. I think that is definitely a common prayer, that we
Yeah,
can look for a hope for a dialogue of peace, or at least
yeah,
some understanding.
yeah.
But thank you so much for being here on this 39th day of 75 days of partition. For all of you who had the chance to listen to this incredible conversation that I had the privilege of having with Professor Jain, please join us tomorrow again for day 40 of 75 days of partition, which, just to remind you, is a daily micro podcast series being aired for 75 days between June 3rd, 2022 and August 17th to commemorate the 75th anniversary of partition in 2022. And the series entails live conversation bursts with historians, filmmakers, authors, art makers, and other practitioners who are specifically working on uncovering and understanding the history of partition. The goal is to introduce new findings to you, to spark your curiosity, explore new perspectives, and bend your mind and perhaps change your perspectives through short daily micro discussions. Thank you so much for joining us. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.